Flight 19. The mystery that created the Bermuda Triangle. December 5, 1945. 5 U.S. Navy aircraft took off from Florida on what was supposed to be a routine training mission. The flight was expected to last only a few hours, but before the day was over, all 5 aircraft had disappeared. 14 U.S. Navy and Marine Corps personnel vanished over the Atlantic Ocean. No distress signal, no wreckage, no survivors. Just hours later, a rescue aircraft sent to find them also disappeared, leaving behind one of aviation's greatest unsolved mysteries. Today, many people know this region as the Bermuda Triangle. But in 1945, no one called it that. So what really happened to Flight 19? Was it simply a tragic chain of navigational mistakes, or did something else happen over the Atlantic that afternoon? This is the true story of Flight 19. If you enjoy stories of history, tragedy, and real events that changed the world, welcome to Missing History. Let's uncover the past, one story at a time. A routine training flight. On the afternoon of December 5, 1945, the United States Navy launched what should have been another routine training flight. At 2:10 p.m., 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers lifted off from Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale in southern Florida. The mission was known simply as Flight 19. Although World War II had ended only a few months earlier, naval aviators continued training almost every day. Navigation, formation flying, and bombing practice remained essential even in peacetime. The 5 aircraft carried 14 men. The flight was led by Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor, a combat veteran with hundreds of hours of flying experience. Taylor had flown combat missions in the Pacific during World War II and was regarded as an experienced naval aviator. Most of the other pilots, however, were still in training. Their assignment that afternoon followed a familiar route that had been flown many times before. The route was straightforward. First, they would fly east from the Florida coast to Hens and Chicken Shoals, a shallow coral reef used as a bombing practice range. There, each aircraft would release practice bombs against designated targets. Once the exercise was complete, the formation would continue farther east over the Atlantic. They would then turn north for a short distance before finally turning west and returning to Fort Lauderdale. Under normal conditions, the entire mission was expected to take about 2.5 hours. The weather forecast gave little reason for concern. Visibility was generally good, with scattered clouds over the Atlantic and moderate winds typical for early December. Nothing suggested that this routine afternoon flight would become one of the greatest mysteries in aviation history. Shortly after takeoff, the 5 Avengers crossed Florida's coastline and continued eastward over the Atlantic. Below them stretched endless coral reefs, pale sandbanks, and hundreds of small islands surrounded by the deep blue Atlantic. Long strips of white sand, shallow reefs, and winding channels repeated themselves for hundreds of miles, making visual navigation far more difficult than it appeared. For experienced crews following their planned course, this usually posed little problem. But if a pilot became uncertain of his position, those same beautiful islands could quickly become a confusing maze. At first, everything unfolded exactly as planned. The formation reached the bombing range, completed the exercise, and prepared to continue to the next phase of the mission. No one on the ground had any reason to believe that anything was wrong. Within the next hour, everything would change. Everything was going according to plan. At first, nothing seemed unusual. After leaving Fort Lauderdale, Flight 19 followed its assigned route over the Atlantic exactly as planned. Roughly 30 minutes after takeoff, The formation arrived over Hens and Chicken Shoals, the U.S. Navy's designated bombing range east of the Florida coast. One by one, the Avengers descended toward their targets. Each aircraft released practice bombs before climbing back into formation. The exercise was completed without incident. No mechanical problems were reported. The weather remained favorable. Radio communication was normal. By every indication, the mission was unfolding exactly as it had on countless previous training flights. With the bombing exercise complete, Flight 19 began the second phase of its mission. The formation continued eastward over the Atlantic before preparing to make the next scheduled turn. This phase of the exercise demanded far more than simply flying. It tested a pilot's ability to navigate across open ocean using little more than a compass, a clock, a map, and a method known as dead reckoning. Unlike flying over land, there were few recognizable landmarks. The farther the aircraft traveled from Florida, the more the world below became a repeating pattern of blue water, coral reefs, and scattered islands. Every heading, every minute, and every calculation had to be accurate. A small navigational error might go unnoticed at first, but over the course of an hour, that error could grow into dozens of miles. For military pilots, this was precisely why navigation training was so important. Then, at approximately 3:40 p.m., the first signs of trouble appeared. Controllers at Fort Lauderdale received a radio transmission unlike anything they expected to hear during a routine training flight. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor. But his tone was different. He no longer sounded confident. Instead, he sounded uncertain, concerned. Moments later, Taylor made a radio transmission that would later become one of the defining moments in the Flight 19 mystery. "We can't be sure where we are." Then another message followed. "We seem to be lost. We can't see land." The controllers immediately realized the situation had become serious. A formation of 5 naval aircraft was no longer certain of its own position. Soon afterward came another report. "Both my compasses are out." Whether the instruments had actually failed, were malfunctioning, or were being interpreted incorrectly has never been conclusively determined. What is known is that Taylor no longer trusted the information they were providing. For the first time that afternoon, Flight 19 was no longer following a routine training mission. It was trying to find its way home. Every decision mattered. Within minutes of Taylor's first distress call, the control tower at Fort Lauderdale began trying to determine Flight 19's actual position. The controllers asked a series of questions. What could the pilots see below? Where was the sun? What direction was the wind blowing? Every answer might provide another clue, but almost immediately it became clear that the greatest problem was no longer the compasses. It was uncertainty. From his radio transmissions, Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor appeared convinced that Flight 19 was somewhere over the Florida Keys, south of the Florida mainland. The controllers reached a very different conclusion. Based on the original flight plan, the elapsed flight time, and the normal cruising speed of the TBM Avengers, they believed the formation was actually east of Florida, somewhere north of the Bahamas. If the controllers were right, the safest course was simple. Turn west. Florida would eventually appear ahead. But if Taylor's assessment was correct, turning west could carry the formation farther away from home. Neither side knew with certainty who was right. That uncertainty would shape every decision that followed. One radio transmission has become especially significant to historians. At one point, another pilot in the formation was heard saying, "If we would just fly west, we would get home." The brief remark suggests that not everyone aboard Flight 19 shared Taylor's assessment of their location. Unfortunately, many of the original radio recordings have been lost. Only partial transcripts survive. As a result, historians still cannot reconstruct every conversation that took place inside the formation that afternoon. Military procedure also left the other pilots with a difficult choice. Flight 19 was flying as a single naval formation, not as 5 independent aircraft. The flight leader was responsible for navigation, and the rest of the formation was expected to remain together. Breaking formation over the open Atlantic carried enormous risks. An aircraft flying alone would have had little chance of being located if it also became lost or was forced to ditch. Remaining together offered the greatest possibility of survival, even if there was disagreement about which direction to fly. Meanwhile, another danger was steadily growing: fuel. Each TBM Avenger had departed with enough fuel for the planned mission and a reserve. Under normal conditions, that was more than adequate, but every unexpected turn, every additional mile, and every minute spent searching for land reduced that safety margin. As the afternoon wore on, the weather also began to change. Cloud cover gradually increased, the wind strengthened, the Atlantic grew rougher beneath the aircraft. There was no catastrophic storm. But for pilots who no longer knew exactly where they were, even modest changes in weather made navigation far more difficult. As daylight slowly faded, distinguishing the horizon from the sea became increasingly challenging. The familiar reference points every pilot depended upon were beginning to disappear. Radio transmissions also became weaker. Some messages were interrupted by static. Others were received only in fragments. Controllers continued calling Flight 19, repeating the same instruction: turn west, if possible. Whether every aircraft still heard those transmissions, no one knows. Then, as the final hours of daylight approached, the most unforgiving limit of all was drawing near: fuel exhaustion. Whatever chance Flight 19 still had of returning safely was rapidly slipping away. The rescue that never returned. By late afternoon, Flight 19 had been airborne for several hours. Radio transmissions were becoming weaker. Some messages dissolved into static. Others ended before they could be fully understood. For the controllers at Fort Lauderdale, one fact had become impossible to ignore. Flight 19 was missing, and no one knew where to begin looking. Although Lieutenant Charles C. Taylor believed his formation had been near the Florida Keys, Navy controllers continued to estimate that the aircraft were far to the east, somewhere over the Atlantic north of the Bahamas. Without a confirmed position, every decision had to be based on probability rather than certainty. As daylight faded, the United States Navy initiated a search and rescue operation. One of the first aircraft dispatched was a Martin PBM Mariner, carrying the radio call sign Training 49. Unlike Flight 19, the Mariner did not depart from Fort Lauderdale. It took off from Naval Air Station Banana River, farther north along Florida's Atlantic coast, and significantly closer to the estimated search area. On board were 13 crew members. Their mission was straightforward: locate Flight 19, report its position, and rescue any survivors if the missing aircraft had been forced to ditch in the ocean. The Mariner was a large flying boat designed for long-range patrol and rescue operations. Its enormous fuel capacity allowed it to remain airborne for many hours over open water. For missions like this, it was one of the Navy's most capable search aircraft. Shortly after takeoff, the Mariner reported its departure normally. Then, nothing. No distress call, no emergency message, no indication that anything had gone wrong. Radio contact ended abruptly. The rescue aircraft had disappeared as well. Less than an hour later, the merchant tanker SS Gaines Mills reported seeing a brilliant explosion over the Atlantic. According to the crew, a large fireball briefly illuminated the evening sky before flames spread across the surface of the sea. The ship immediately changed course toward the location. When it arrived, the crew found burning fuel floating on the water, but no survivors, no identifiable wreckage, and nothing that could confirm the identity of the aircraft involved. Many aviation historians believe the explosion was most likely the missing PBM Mariner. The reported time and location closely matched the aircraft's expected flight path. Even so, no conclusive evidence has ever been recovered. Officially, the identity of the exploding aircraft remains unconfirmed. The PBM Mariner also had a troubling reputation. Earlier accidents had shown that fuel vapors could accumulate inside parts of the aircraft. If those vapors were ignited, the resulting explosion could destroy the aircraft within seconds. For that reason, some crews had given the Mariner an unfortunate nickname, the Flying Gas Tank. However, the official investigation never declared this to be the definitive cause of its disappearance. It remained only the most plausible explanation based on the available evidence. By the end of that evening, the United States Navy had lost 6 aircraft, 5 TBM Avengers, 1 PBM Mariner, 27 servicemen. What had begun as an ordinary training exercise had become one of the most devastating unexplained aviation losses in post-war U.S. naval history. And with night now covering the Atlantic, the search was only beginning. The birth of a legend. When the sun rose on December 6, 1945, the search for Flight 19 had already become one of the largest air and sea operations in U.S. Navy history. Patrol aircraft took to the skies, destroyers, Coast Guard vessels, and rescue ships spread across the Atlantic. The search stretched from Florida's east coast, across the Bahamas, and into the western Atlantic Ocean. Rescuers hoped to find anything: a life raft, a wing, an oil slick, even a single piece of wreckage could reveal where the 5 Avengers had come down. But hour after hour, and day after day, the Atlantic revealed nothing. No confirmed wreckage, no confirmed trace of the 14 men aboard. The ocean kept its silence. The U.S. Navy opened a formal investigation. Investigators reviewed radio transcripts, weather reports, flight plans, maintenance records, and eyewitness accounts. More than 80 years later, most aviation historians agree that no single event caused the tragedy. Instead, Flight 19 was likely overwhelmed by a combination of navigational uncertainty, deteriorating conditions, communication difficulties, and eventually fuel exhaustion. That explanation fits the available evidence. Yet one crucial question remains unanswered. Where did the aircraft come down? Without confirmed wreckage, their final moments can never be reconstructed with complete certainty. Ironically, when Flight 19 disappeared in 1945, the name Bermuda Triangle did not yet exist. It would be almost 2 decades before writers and journalists began connecting a series of disappearances across the western Atlantic into a single mysterious region. At the center of those stories stood Flight 19. Not because it was the first disappearance, but because it became the best documented and one of the most difficult to explain. From that moment on, the waters bounded by Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico became known around the world as the Bermuda Triangle. Over the decades, other ships and aircraft would also disappear inside those same waters. Some vanished without sending a distress call, others left behind almost no trace. Each new case added another layer to the growing mystery. But mystery is not evidence. To this day, there is no scientific proof that the Bermuda Triangle possesses mysterious forces capable of causing ships or aircraft to disappear. What remains instead are real accidents, real investigations, and real questions that history has never fully answered. Flight 19 was only the beginning. In the years that followed, merchant ships, military aircraft, passenger planes, and even giant cargo vessels would all become linked to the Bermuda Triangle. Some of those disappearances have reasonable explanations, others remain unsolved. Together, they transformed a stretch of the Atlantic Ocean into one of the most enduring mysteries of the modern world. Yet, despite the stories that grew around it, the fate of Flight 19 itself remains unchanged. After decades of investigation, no one knows exactly what happened that afternoon. And perhaps that is why its story continues to endure. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If you enjoyed this documentary and would like to explore more remarkable stories from the past, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and joining us again for another journey into history. Until next time, this is Missing History. Thank you for watching.